Welcome to our next video from the series. This one's entitled Rests. With rests, we have units of silence, units of tacitness, periods of inactivity, and these are the symbols for those. For every note value that we have in music, regardless of what it is, we have an equivalent rest value, or a unit of silence for the same period of time. What we've got here is the breve rest. Here's the equivalent breve note, and this is sometimes how people write them as well, even with a single line on both sides. The whole note is acceptable, and these are also known as double whole notes. So a breve rest occupies one entire space on the staff. The breve note looks like these right here. The whole rest looks like this, and this is half of a rectangle hanging down from the fourth line of the staff if it's in a single voice layer. It needs to be here. If we have multiple voices, we can move these around somewhere else, but in a single line, it needs to go on this line, the fourth line up, so not any other one. The half rest looks like the inverse of the whole rest, and it comes up from the third line of the staff. Not any other one unless we have multiple voices, like in the last video. So whole rest, whole note, half rest, half note, they look about the same. The breve rest looks like essentially looks like two whole notes, or both of these rests put together, occupying an entire space. This one specifically, by the way. So there's where these ones need to be. The breve rest is very unusual unless you're very familiar with looking at Renaissance music or medieval music. In today's music, most of the meter isn't large enough to occupy or to use one of these notes, so it's pretty uncommon to see a breve rest, or a breve for that matter. Whole rests are pretty common, very common in fact. Half rest, equivalent of the half note. Quarter rest, this is my version of it, looks like this and occupies essentially that middle of the staff area, the equivalent of a quarter rest. So in 4/4 time, for instance, this is also worth one beat of tacitness or silence, reticence. The eighth rest, my version of it again, it's just a half of a beat in 4/4 time, for instance. And the equivalent eighth note, and then a 16th note rest, and a 16th note, and so on. As we get more beams or more flags, tails on notes, 32nd note, 64th note, so on, we get one new little arm on the rest. So for instance, a 32nd note rest would look like the 16th, but would have a third arm, a 64th rest, and so on. And the whole rest can also double, like I said, as an entire measure of rest, regardless of the time signature or the meter that we're in. In 3/8 time, we only have the room for the equivalent of 3/8 notes, or one dotted quarter note. There's no more room it can cram into a single measure. So in this melody line here, we have a C for a quarter note, occupying the space of 2/8 notes, and this E here is being our eighth note, 3/8 notes in the measure, bar line. Same thing here with regard to value. But then we could see, if we wanted an entire measure of rest, we could see we would use a whole rest to occupy one entire measure, even though full well this is too much metric space to fit into this meter. So this is still the common practice. Rather than putting, say, a dotted quarter rest into the measure, which would really occupy the space nicely, it's not the convention, it's not the thing to do. If we want an entire measure of rest, we want the whole rest. It's a universal symbol for one entire measure of rest in the meter, regardless of the meter. There is a caveat to this. If you're in a meter signature that is far too large to occupy just that, for instance, if we were in, say, 4/1 time, or something where we would need more than a whole rest to occupy that space, then that breve rest that we talked about in the last video is the convention to use to occupy one entire measure. Or, the breve rest could be used to occupy one entire measure of rest in a meter that's too large for just the whole rest. Otherwise, this is still the unit that's used to occupy one entire measure of rest. And here's an example from standard music literature, from Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, very, very common theme from the Promenade, the opening measures of the whole piece. He originally scored this for piano solo. Later, as you know, probably other orchestrators, notably Ravel, arranged this for a full orchestra. But the melody, the opening melody, is right here, and he has this mixed meter opening where the first measure is in 5/4 time, second measure 6/4 time. Both of these meters are too large to hold just a whole note rest, but this is the convention to use for the left hand of the piano so that it doesn't have to play anything. It's tacit while the right hand plays the well-known melody. So even though this is only 4 beats otherwise, if it sits in the measure only, all by itself, then it's understood that this is one entire measure of complete rest. This is the symbol that you want to use. And note that it is hanging down from the 4th line of the staff. This is where we want it. Another example of a single melody line that features rests. In 6/8 time, we have the equivalent of 2 dotted quarter notes per measure. And they can be subdivided, of course, into 2 groups of triplet eighth notes. Beat 1, beat 2. Beat 1, beat 2. Notice the beaming. Beat 1, all beam together. Beat 2, broken off of that beam because it's part of the second beat. And then if we have rests for the rest of this measure, we need 2 eighth note rests. We've already broken into the subdivision of the beat. The primary beat unit is a dotted quarter note. So this is what we call the first level of subdivision. The first time we've made change for the beat unit. This is how it subdivides. It doesn't divide into even to 2 eighth notes, it divides into 3. So if we've broken into the second beat, we have to close it out with the same metric unit. So if we have a single eighth note sitting here representing part of the second beat, but the remainder of the measure is rest, we need 2 eighth note rests. Because to pull this down, this second beat only, if I wrote this, even though it's mathematically accurate, it doesn't show the other 1/3 of the beat. We're missing. We need a representative, a character representative, to actually sit there and show us where the other 1/3 of the beat is. So this is the only way to accurately write the second half of this beat. What one never needs are these ties up here that I wrote on here. I see this in scores on occasion, and I understand the concept that we're wanting to say that this is all continuous rest here, but ties are never necessary when you're writing rests. In fact, please don't do that. Same thing here. If we wanted to end our piece of music, maybe with a double bar, and we wanted to end with 2 measures of complete silence, this tie is absolutely unnecessary. That would be correct. So now it's more accurate.